This mountain was not formed through a natural process. It's exactly 20 degrees, and it matches a ridgeline in Arizona. Why? If I'd told myself a couple years ago that there's a ridgeline in Arizona that matches one in Italy perfectly, I would have laughed and said it's a complete coincidence. But it's not. And today we're going to examine the evidence supporting that and provide you with the information that'll enable you to go confirm this yourself. I've spent the past 2 years cataloging, researching, and identifying this prehistoric world culture. And when I say prehistoric, I mean a time before the flood. You see, this culture was advanced, and it did span the globe, and there's evidence of that. But when you think of ancient prehistoric cultures, it's definitely not what you think. And it's what took me a long time to figure that out. This culture's art and design style was really hard to understand, and in fact, I never noticed it. The only thing I noticed was their sacred geometry, because this culture also adhered to a strict geometric standard. It seems like everything that they made geometrically is divisible by 20 degrees. So if you find something that's a measurable angle in nature, or in these stones, it turns out to be 20, 40, 60, 80, and we're going to look at some of those 20 degrees later. But a quick backstory to just get you up to speed on how this all unfolded was, I found some stones that were very strange in my home state of West Virginia. I ended up realizing that they all kind of fell into this geometric standard. After I identified the standard, I traveled to Europe and confirmed the same thing. But before I went, I noticed something that was pretty insane. I realized while watching YouTube one day, it was a subject about these walls of North America. You know, there's all these random, walls, stacked up walls throughout North America that, they presume the natives did for some reason. Some of them resemble serpents. And in that video, I noticed stuck in that wall was one of these shapes. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is happening is these artifacts that I've identified, the prehistoric culture, or not the prehistoric culture, but rather the native cultures, they identified these things also and stacked them up in worship of this deity. And then it clicked. Those megalithic sites in Europe that we're all so familiar with, what if those stones and those formations and those giant megaliths that, they can't really figure out what's carved on them and, where they came from and this and that, it's all a big mystery. What if those stones are these also? It only took a second to find a photo, and I realized, oh my gosh, that's nearly the same thing as what I've identified here. And there was something else. They were tearing into a mountain not far from me and a couple towns over where they're doing some construction and building new roads. And I thought, this is a good chance to go look and see what's inside these hills of West Virginia. And I was blown away by what I saw. It was essentially a shark face, and a couple other images. And what I ended up determining was that the whole hill that they were working on looked like a shark. And when you looked at it in the prehistoric context, well, it's an ancient river valley, and that shark was spanning that river essentially like a pinch point. It really looks like a strategic area. But either way, I went to Europe armed with that information. So I knew from the get-go, okay, something's not right with geology. If all this is just millions of years of process, I shouldn't have seen that shark image that closely resembles a World War II nose art. But I did. And so things are not as they seem already. So arriving in Italy, I quickly verified pretty much the same stuff, same shapes. It was actually fairly easy and quick. And this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about that you guys can confirm yourself. Every stream, seemingly in the world, is full of it. But before we get into what else I found in Italy, like the new geoglyph that nobody's ever seen before, or the ancient temple site, or any number of other things that we're going to discuss, let's take a look at some of these artifacts that we've already identified, some of these 20-degree artifacts, and examples of what you might find yourself. Okay, here we have our 20-degree examples, some from Italy, some from North America. And before we get into those, I just want to give you a brief idea of what it is that these are. We know this is feathered serpent worship. We know that their art style is effigy and impressionist based. So we're not going to see full examples of art. It's just going to loosely look like certain things. One of the things that they worshipped was the seven-headed serpent. And in our examples in India and other places, you can clearly see these multiple heads attached. And we've learned that that's very likely what this is. So these are all probably, they all had, 6 other matches to whatever one you find, because there should be 7 each. But the reason there's so many of these bizarre things that we're finding is because they were effigies and representations attached to larger statues that represented a very serious god that they worshipped. And so to get into it, I do have some drawings that I've made, but the ones I don't have drawings of we'll get into first. And this is one of my favorite examples. It looks really boring, but it also happens to be the example that Jimmy from Bright Insight is standing next to in this photo. I also found one on the beach in Sicily that will be in the location that we'll discuss a little bit later. And the other one that I've got is this guy here. These are also 20 degrees, but they're more rounded. The rest of this stuff is pretty much, a 20-degree slant with the tail cut off. But this isn't. However, they're still 20 degrees. I feel like there's some other examples. There's definitely another example in Italy of this. And also this one, I believe, somewhere. The ones that we do have drawings for are these. So this is the first one, which will be these over here. And all it is just a loose representation. The longest side, or the widest side, it's usually at a slant, is usually the mouth. And that's generally the case on almost all of these. And as you move along, we get into the next, which happens to be these guys right here. But this is the most prominent. This is probably what you can go find immediately. And, I should note, the 20 degree is the most prominent, and I now believe that's likely because it's the core divisible number. And you should be able to find a 20 degree uninterrupted, or interrupted rather. So it's like a 20 degree angle with the tail cut off. And that's what all these are, just some variation of that 20 degrees, with some kind of modification. And when we measure them, they end up being all 20 degrees. This one becomes a little bit important later. Here's another example. This is also one that we have examples across the world, and happens to be a pretty interesting one, because actually, if you look at it, this side's our feathered dragon side, but when you flip it, it's like some other animal. I'm not really sure what. A lot of these do transform in that way. Göbekli Tepe also has one of these that seems to be pictured in one of their photos. And what this is just a 20-degree feathered serpent effigy. It's a loose representation. Here's Ghost Dragon. This one's kind of fun, and that can be categorized as like these examples here. If you'll note, there's almost a tail, and some of them have a wing, and some of them actually can be multiple shapes. This will be a shape that we'll get into. I think it goes, how's it go? There it is. So this direction is one of our 20 degree standard shapes, and this direction happens to be another, I think it's like an 80 or 60 degree. But it's like combos. Same with this one. This one's super weird. It actually changes into, that's a 60 degree angle, but when it's looked at this direction, it's 20 degrees. And there's 2 standardized versions of this, or 2 categories rather. So moving along from these ghosts, oh yeah, well that's part of the ghost. Kind of the same thing. It's pretty much ghost without a tail. I mean, you can see what's going on here, right? Like, it's kind of obvious. It's 20 degrees, shaped in some way. And I highly suggest you guys put 20 degree increments on a piece of paper like this and take it out into the field, and you can measure these things immediately. You'll be like, oh yeah, it's 20 degrees. Everyone I find is 20 degrees. But moving on, this one I found, I didn't realize how interesting it was until I put it under light and, checked it out. And it ended up blowing my mind, really, and became a very important piece. And so once we get to this point, see, most of these, like I said, the wider point is the mouth. The mouth is facing that way. It's if you look at a shape and you want to pretend that it's something, naturally you want to make the point to the front. But in reality, the majority of these, the flat side is the front, and the point, or the tapered side, is the back. So here's where we start to convert into, it's a 20 degree, but it's reversed, where there is, like, the head is coming to a point. And it's this guy. And actually, this guy is important because he matches and connects us to Carnac, France, and is one of the ones that I later connect to Sicily. If you stay tuned, you're going to get to see some of these other things that we got going. And in fact, mentioning that, I forgot to talk about this guy over here. This is one from Italy, and this is one of the general 20 degree shapes. But it's also when I have another example of a European megalithic site. In this photo, you can see clearly that those massive stones are the same shape. I do apologize for the lawnmower in the background. This is the only time I got to record. This has to happen. So, sorry. But anyways, moving along, slightly annoying. So like I was saying, we have these that are connected to our megalithic sites in Europe that happen to be actually important. And just, I guess, the remainders, this is also would be of the Karnak version. But these guys, in fact, it's not really in the same, it's like an extreme open mouth. I don't know if you can tell. I don't like that. But yeah, these are also 20 degrees, but it's this way, if that makes sense. And then the last, these two. See how this kind of looks dopey? That's a thing in this culture. The dopey vibe is definitely something that they're portraying for some reason. But ultimately, when my kid was drawing faces in some of these examples, without seeing the dopey face, she drew the dopey face in one. I thought it was actually pretty funny. But to get on with this story, these shapes are standardized across the world. Whether you're in Asia, in Russia, South America, or Africa, you're going to be able to find these shapes in stone. And they're going to be various stones to include whatever's natural to your area. It's because these loose stones were actually statue fragments. And their geometries do not deviate. You can find this in your own local natural areas. And in fact, the 20 degree is what you are most likely to find. So I urge you to look, and not trust me, but to go find yourself these slanted shapes and then attempt to measure it, and if you're not too confident, get somebody to help you with it. Moving on, this is what's important. This is what we're noting, and as we continue this journey, we're going to see how this applies to this world culture. The whole reason I came to know about this mountain is actually a pretty interesting story. And it was just following clues and tracking down information that I kept discovering. You see, I'd made my initial verifications, and I was really satisfied after a trip to the beach where I found so much, to include these very significant cuts that we see that match the cuts in all these other megalithic locations. It was clear to me that my culture is also this culture. Who's responsible for all this stuff in the world that's, bizarre and unexplainable and dealing with stone and weights we can't move? It's this culture. And so when I found those cuts matching the rest of the world, I was like, done. I mean, that was a big deal for me. And it might not be as impressive for you, but it literally verified my insanity of, collecting all these rocks in West Virginia that seemed to match rocks in Italy. And so learning from my previous experiences of looking, at the maps in my local area and finding really interesting formations, I thought, you know what, instead of just, packing it up and going and getting some gelato, we better look at the maps in my area that I was in Italy, or Sicily rather. And I found something pretty quick. Those same walls that I originally saw on YouTube, well, there seemed to be some of these walls not far from where we were staying. In fact, those walls made up an image, a geoglyph that nobody's ever talked about before. This geoglyph clearly is a feathered serpent. And what blew my mind was it was matching one of these previously identified shapes from North America. After I arrived in Italy, I found one of those small shapes that matched the North American ones. And that one was near identical to that geoglyph. How the hell is that possible? It was the most Goonies moment of my life. I felt like I was holding up the doubloon to the coastline. Like, it was insane. So we planned to go there and see what else we could find. On the way there, we ended up seeing a lot of interesting stuff. The first thing you notice is this massive turd snake. Yeah, I don't know what else to call it, but it definitely looks like a couple logs. But this snake head, right in front of it, is clearly some quarried stone that actually ended up matching some stuff I had seen previously. Just offshore, in Trapani Peninsula, is some quarried stone underneath the waterline. That means that stone, or what we were looking at here in these images, was done at least before the water level rose. Okay, that's good. Now we know at least how old what we're looking at is. And moving on, you ended up finding so many things that just kept confirming what it is that we were finding in North America. We found many matching examples. Same geometries. The reason that these things look remotely similar is because the core geometry is exact. You can have core geometry that's exact and then external geometry that can vary. That's possible. And in fact, when you draw blueprints, it's essentially drawn just like that. You have a core center line and everything's built off of that. And you can have core center lines that are the same, but everything built away from those can be different. So they'll have faint similarities, and that's what we're seeing here. But later, I found that there was this bizarre cut in this mountain that opened up into the mouth of the dragon. There were very bizarre things going on all over that cliff edge. And I couldn't help but remember back to the potential bone that I found that looks to be from a small individual. Could you imagine these ancients standing in the mouth of this dragon effigy doing their thing? I know I did in that moment. It gave me chills. Like, all this was huge for me. As a nobody who's tracking down this massive mystery and it's all unfolding in a legit way, you know, I continuously felt, oh, this is it. I'm done. You know, this is going to be like the peak thing that I find. And it just kept getting bigger. We ended up going back to where we were staying that night, and there was a party on the beach. It put us on the west face of that mountain. And when the sun set and hit that mountain, the shadows produced this shape that is identical to the shapes that I've identified. And when I measured the mountain, it's exactly 20 degrees. More satisfaction, can you imagine? Like, my mind was fully blown in that moment. You know, if you could have been there, my wife was just like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, this is a lot. But things kept getting weirder. Not long after that trip, I had to go to Arizona. And my intention with that trip was, okay, I'm going to use this to confirm some stuff. And the first thing I noticed were the Superstition Mountains. There was a strange resemblance to those same mountains in Sicily that were surrounding Monte Cofano and that strange situation. That was one of the first things that was like, oh, okay, that's weird. And as I headed to Tucson, I couldn't help but notice that Picacho Peak had this massive, like, blowing face thing on it. You know, like Zephyrus. I guess it's a Greek god, which really confirms my personal belief that things like the Greek gods are actually derived from this pre-flood culture. And so this face that's on Picacho Peak appears to be blowing west, just like Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. Look across the street and you see some more weird stuff. The Arizona Sphinx was there, matching that thing in Saudi Arabia. But that's for another story. Headed down the road, there's Dragon Mountain that matches one of my other artifacts, this fossilized dragon head. But it wasn't until I was headed to Miss Saigon's in Tucson that my mind was officially blown. I had seen this mountain hundreds of times. And that edge, that slanted edge, you know, it kind of looked a little suspect to me. But I always just thought everything around me was natural in that area. And then, as I glanced at it, I couldn't help but notice this massive star that was appearing as the sun set also. And I thought, there's no way that this is the same crap. And then I thought, I better measure it, I better check it out, I better do something, you know, because it definitely looked like it was 20 degrees. So I overlaid Monte Cofano to the Santa Rita, I guess it's the Santa Rita mountain range, to this mountain, and the ridge line was like, okay, this is creepy. Now this is getting weird. Now this is too much. The only explanation for something like this is if these things are not natural and were done intentionally. There's also something worth mentioning. There's an account, Mysteries of the Deep, Lake Tahoe. I'm not sure. That's what he is on Instagram. He had a video that I briefly mentioned in some other content that there is a scan of Lake Tahoe floor, and there is a landslide anomaly, and this is a very large mountain, essentially, that is beneath Lake Tahoe. And when you look at it, you can't help but notice, I mean, my wife, who really couldn't care less about any of this, when I just showed her that photo, she was like, oh, that looks like Monte Cofano. If what I'm saying and what I'm discovering is true, then that would explain his mystery. That's not a landslide anomaly. That's an intentional structure. And if we consider what we found in Monte Cofano, that's a temple. Because it seems that these temples are not pyramids or anything else interesting that we know of. It's this bizarre 20-degree shape. It's one of the most prominent shapes that I've found besides the 40-degree triangles. It's very important to them for some reason. Maybe it's because it's the base divisible in their geometry. Everything's divisible by 20. But wait, there's more. It does get weirder. Some months later, I traveled to Beartown State Park in West Virginia. And as I travel about that place, I'm very much convinced that none of it's natural, as I see many bizarre things. But it was when I came across this funky door shape. I mean, it's not really a door shape, it's like a bell shape, but it appears almost like it could be a door. And you would discard that thought. But in this modern age, we've got Instagram that's shoving all kinds of other examples in our face. And so in Jordan, we have an example of this bell-shaped feature that's in the stone. And I would like to point out the texture or the weather pattern of that stone, they're the same. So they're two different environments, other parts of the world, and in two different stones, and they have the same weather pattern, the same feature. What if they are not natural formations? What if those are structures in a bizarre art style? And when I consider Monte Cofano and that cutout through the mountain, well, hey, it looks like the texture of that stone is the same. What if that's not a weather pattern? What if that's an intentional design? Because we have 3 different examples in 3 different environments and 3 different stones that match. And I've just demonstrated that there's something bizarre going on with these stones. Everything seems to be matching. And some might say, well, hey, it's, it's how things break off in nature. And no, these are different materials. This is across aluminum. I've got copper. We've got stone. We've got composites. I spent my life in fabrication. I know what materials are what. And it is across all materials, and it's a very intentional thing that we are looking at. In conclusion, is this man-made or natural? And in my opinion, it's neither. It's definitely not natural, but I don't think it's man-made, because in this process, I have found also some examples of petroglyphs that seem to match modern photos. And this would check out for me because professional, metal fab, and I see this aluminum that appears as little balls under magnification. It's not anything that we are capable of. And so if it is a non-human external source that is responsible for all this prehistoric stuff, that might make sense because it's so advanced and so outside of our capabilities. That's why they can move all the massive things, because it wasn't us that moved them. But either way, what we've been taught isn't exactly accurate. Now, I made videos as I was going about this process, and the first couple of videos in this account actually were made in the moments, or at least in the times that these things were unfolding. So I didn't really know the next thing until I made that video. So I suggest that you go check these out. They're a little bit longer, but it's how all this played out. I go into detail of what I found and when. And anybody with reason can see that something's not right, and the evidence is there. Take this information and look at your natural environments and see what you can't find yourselves. You'll be surprised at what you see because the evidence is there. It's just waiting for you to go look.